All right, so we are gonna be talking about this GPSA question today. Is a world with populist leaders desirable today? And the main reason why I picked this is because I already put the outline on the Telegram channel, so you can refer to all the granular details that are already on the outline. And yeah, primarily what I wanted to talk about really is the concept of ideation, i.e., the generation of points. So the thing is that based on, my, I guess, several years teaching this subject by now, this subject is arguably one of the most underestimated ones in JC, simply because, and I guess, in a way it's understandable because it's just simply, oh, it's EL on steroids. If I have the examples, I should be able to generate points, but the problem is that then oftentimes students end up with a piecemeal analysis. That means they write their analysis based on examples rather than the big picture, And of course, in order to really do well for GP, ideation is a critical skill. And this also helps in, your future academic career. If let's say, you're going to university and you are taking a higher level of studies, right? And obviously, all the more so if you're going to the arts or social sciences. And the main thing underpinning the concept of ideation is the usage of frameworks. Okay, and in this case, really, it's definitions, I guess, or typical descriptions of how institutions and stakeholders behave in society in general. Now, without further ado, we are going to jump straight into this, all right? As with any essay question, first step, what you want to do, and you guys must have heard it like, ad nauseum by now, but it bears repeating, right? Identify and define your key terms. So in this case, is a world with populist leaders desirable today, right? The most controversial key term being the word is, because it suggests an absolute state, and in which case, when placed within the this particular syntax, all right, it actually suggests a very binary look at this issue, i.e., is it a case of like, do we want populist leaders or do we not want populist leaders? All right. But that's really par for the course. It's one of the simpler things to deal with. Really, what we need to deal with here is the question's assertion, i.e., whether or not populist leaders are desirable, and unpacking the subject matter in itself. That means, what actually are populist leaders. So let's deal with the assertion first, all right? When we talk about whether something is desirable or not, okay, then obviously if you just paraphrase it in a very simple way, it just means, do you want it? Do you not want it? Right? The bigger question that you should ask really is, what would cause us to either desire or not desire populist leaders? Okay. Oops, sorry. There was a bit of a lag there. All right, here we go. Now, the next step that we have to ask ourselves then, right, is how then do we unpack the subject matter? Because when we talk about populist leaders in general, it is related to how a country should be run. And so the next question that we should ask ourselves is, how should leaders of a country behave? Okay, so here we go. How should they behave? All right. And this is where we need to think about the role of governments in society in general. All right. So broadly speaking, what governments should do and what they should seek to do should be to deal with short and long-term issues in society, and of course, other things like fostering unity, raising standards of living, having go-to institutions, being the go-to, institution to deal with, social issues, simply on the basis that they have the most resources in society. So that's the ideal version of a government, right? How governments should behave and how they should, interact with their citizens and build that sort of positive, government-citizen relationship. On the other hand, now we need to consider what populist leaders actually are. And the biggest question here would be, how do they actually behave? All right, how do populist leaders actually behave? How do they operate? What's their MO? So on and so forth. All right. Now, the definition of populist leaders really is that they are leaders who represent the masses against the elite and their ilk. So what does this actually mean? If we look at the current context, or I guess the current political context in the world right now, what you see really is a slew of leaders, right? And this really started, happening from about 2015, 2016, that era, okay? These leaders, right, they claim that, hey, elites in society, they are, milking the rest of the population, so on and so forth, okay? Now, this is somewhat understandable, especially when you look at how corporations behave or certain, stakeholders in society with disproportionate amounts of power and influence, how they behave, right? And some, really obvious examples of that would be things like, let's say, the Me Too movement, where you look at how producers, or in this case specifically Harvey Weinstein, how he behaved in relation to, actresses. If you look at corporations, how they are so ruthless, in terms of cutting jobs, especially in tough times like right now, while giving their CEOs, big fat checks for bonuses because, hey, the company did its highest profit margin in the past year, so on and so forth, right? So things like that. Now, I just want to be clear also, okay? There is a difference between a populist leader and a popular one. A popular one just means that, that particular leader enjoys a lot of popular support. Many people support that leader lah. Populist leaders, on the other hand, have a very specific way of doing things, right? And it's based on what I'm talking about earlier, and also, how I'll unpack it in greater detail later on. But suffice to say, some prominent populist leaders, in the world right now would be people like, let's say, Erdogan in Turkey, or of course, in USA, you have the idiot orange, right? POTUS 45, who's trying to come back and run again in 2024. And the thing is that populist leaders, they often act on racial, religious, and other forms of, divisive platforms. Specifically, most of the time they act on cultural platforms, okay? And they often do this, which ends up being divisive. All right. So we are talking, if let's say we are talking about the Singapore context, you'll be looking at leaders like Lim Tian or what's his face, Chee Soon Juan. Okay, in the what's that party called again? I'm spacing out on it right now. Singapore Democratic Party. All right. So on that basis, okay, that's one of their behaviors, that's one of their MOs, right? And then we compare to the ideal of governance that we talked about earlier, So dealing with issues, etc., right? Or etc., for all those who actually caught that reference, kudos, okay? But populist leaders, they act on divisive platforms. On this basis, if a country or a society is divided, can it actually then deal with, the salient issues of the day? I would argue no, not at all, right? Because then they'll be too busy being embroiled in things like cultural wars and so on and so forth. Okay. And there we go, right? We already have one counter argument right there, right? So on that basis, we don't want populist leaders because they only bring divisions. Now, we also need to think about, how populist leaders present themselves. Because most of the time, right, in the first place, why these populist leaders can end up enjoying popular support is because they present themselves as, seemingly for the masses, but actually they end up doing shit that's self-aggrandizing, right? So, I mean, obviously, you look at Trump. Okay, just a couple of days ago, it came out on the news that he and his previous lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, had been selling presidential pardons for $2 million. Things like that, right? But on the surface of it, okay, to his supporters, he presents this platform of, oh yeah, I'm for the working, American, the working class, right? Bring back coal because, the decline of the coal industry is causing us to lose jobs, without actually, considering the fact that, hey, maybe coal is dying out because of the existential crisis that we face in a form of climate change, and the fact that the world is already pivoting towards renewable energy as a whole, So populist leaders, if they present themselves as such and they gaslight the public, okay, into thinking that, yeah, they're great for society, do we really want them if all they do really is to, create or accrue more benefits for themselves, right? No, not exactly. So in on this basis, okay, again, you see, we have a second counter argument here, right? We don't really want such leaders. And now you have two body paragraphs to write. On the flip side of things, okay, purely on the basis that if we get a leader who actually represents the masses against the elites, right? And they fight back against, institutions, stakeholders, individuals with that sort of disproportionate chokehold on power and influence, then obviously we would want such people because, it's not about creating, a very, very strict or pure form of equality, but really is to prevent exploitation of the masses, right? And such leaders, would be people like, let's say, oh yeah, I use this example in the outline, Anwar, fighting back against the long entrenched, corruption that's present in the Malaysian society. And for the H2 history students, you should know how this corruption came about. All right. But if you're not sure, feel free to drop me a text, ask me a question. Okay. So just if we, have that very narrow, I guess, definition or narrow look at how populist leaders behave, then yes, certainly, we want such leaders. All right. So then you have your supporting argument. Okay. So populist leaders Sorry about this. I left my stylus at the office. It's a brain fart moment. That fight for the masses. Oh God. Okay, here we go. So you have 3 points here, right? Now, at this juncture, of course, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, ultimately, right, even as we consider all these different, ideas that we have, okay, do we truly and fundamentally want them, even if they can bring certain benefits, like, being willing to take on those with a shit ton of control and influence in society? I would say no, because at their very core, right, populist leaders, they are often too volatile and unstable. So think back to, what I said earlier about them using divisive sort of platforms, right? If their platforms are divisive, that usually means that, they would create more divisions in society, okay? In the first place, all the salient current affairs of today, right, arguably is partly due to populist leaders. So election of populist leaders in the first place gave rise to this very highly charged and divisive, world that we see. And now we defer back to the basic definition of, the ideal government, right? What we truly expect the competent government to do. And competent governments, or best leaders in this case, since we are dealing with the individual here, best leaders are those who are willing to make the tough decisions, right? To implement, measured policies that can bring the most welfare and benefit to society as a whole, while at the same time, not doing it at the expense of others, maybe let's say certain communities or groups like your minorities, so on and so forth. So such leaders, right, sometimes also implement policies or make decisions that may not necessarily be popular in the eyes of the masses. Okay, so think about things like, let's say, if we talk about Singapore, right? If looking at the cooling measures that are implemented for housing nowadays, or allowing the COE prices to continue to rise in order to curb, the increase in the number of cars in Singapore as a whole. Although on a side note, that's not really the reason why, like, what I mean by not really the reason for the increase of cars is not because of an increase in demand, or for the econ students here, increase in quantity demanded. No. It's really due to private hire car companies, but let's not get into that. Okay, so because we want, ultimately at the end of the day, we want governments that have the proverbial cojones, right, to make the tough decisions. Okay, so we want leaders with measured policies. Okay, and that's how we generate all the points, because this last point is more of an evaluative point rather than, your box standard or support counter argument. Right, of course, for deeper levels of analysis, you need to explain the specific impacts of each example while evaluating the extent to which these ideas are true. And for that, refer to the outline that's already posted on Telegram. And yeah, that's pretty much how ideation works. All right. In summary, right, after you identify and define all your key terms, the basic thought process here should be, which institution or stakeholder, that means like governments or businesses or communities, so on and so forth, which ones are involved in this question, okay? And think about how they behave to create certain issues in society. All right. And then afterwards, you apply it to the question's assertion. Okay. You just simply need to rephrase those ideas to answer the question. Then the examples come in afterwards. So in the first place, you shouldn't be writing your essays based on examples, but rather based on all these ideas about how institutions and stakeholders behave in society. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Again, if you have more questions, if there's anything that's unclear, please feel free to drop me a text, right? I know ultimately this is really for marketing, but at the end of the day, I'm still a teacher first and foremost. So, hey, if you want to clarify anything, please don't be shy. Drop me a text, all right? Or, if you want a trial lesson, yeah, come on down, right? And yes, finally, in light of the year just simply flying by, as I feel myself aging, rapidly every year. I've opened my place for self-study. So if you'd like to capitalize on that, please, again, like WhatsApp, and yeah, we can come to an arrangement. Other than that, hope this helps, and all the best for your mid-years. Yeah. So till next time.